driven by the fear and by the feelings that they have because of this disorder. So we cannot ignore it anymore as, oh boy, these are individual issues, individual circumstances. A couple of excerpts from this chapter. Ron, an Israeli, says, I was sitting in a cafe a regular day. I was talking to a friend when suddenly, on the other side of the street, a powerful explosion was heard. I don't remember exactly what happened. I only remember my feeling at that long minute of blood, sweat, and suffering that is hard to describe. You can only feel it deep inside. There was a boom and then silence. And right after the silence, there were weak cries for help, which is hard for me to forget even today. After the incident, I couldn't fall asleep at nights. I became a very intolerant person, and I used to become nervous for any nonsense. At night, I used to find myself wide awake for many hours. I used to go back to the place of the event, trying to understand. Ibrahim, a Palestinian from Gaza, said, our house was destroyed in an air attack. My parents' house, and we did not have a place to sleep for 3 months. But the most painful thing for all of us, the people under the rubble of the house after it was destroyed. First, it was my little brother, who will never forget in all my life, and I remember every minute. But also my son. To this day, the pain and the sorrow don't leave the door of our house. After the incident, I always felt like being strangled, without energy, helpless, and also anxious for the family. I'm constantly worried and apprehensive that an incident like this will happen again. The last chapter on the book is on peace and reconciliation. I thought it was the most important chapter, but unfortunately it was the one in which I could find the least material. I found a number of things that psychology can bring to reconciliation between the two peoples. For instance, one of them has to do with communication styles. Many times during negotiations, and there is a lot of evidence that this happened during some of the peace processes, the difference in communication between the two people become a barrier. The Israelis have a style that is called dugri, which means direct to the point, which is very similar to the American style. The Arabs in general, and Palestinians in particular, use a communication style called musaire, which actually means accommodation, in which the point is not to offend the person you are having a conversation with. So it's very vague, very circular. You have to read between the lines. You don't point fingers. You don't go to the point. And in a number of times, negotiations almost broke down, and in some smaller groups, like negotiations that had to do with traffic, for instance, at least in one instance, actually the negotiations collapsed because misunderstandings in communication. Also negotiation models. We use a negotiation model which is called distributive bargaining, which essentially is the idea of I have a pie, we have to divide the pie. Psychology tells us that that negotiation model always leaves both people with a sense of loss. It's a loss-loss model because both people have to give up, and that's the emphasis, what you gave up. There are other negotiations models, for instance, like integrative bargaining, in which the point is you start with an end goal. What is it that we want? This is what we want at the end. Okay, let's take one step backwards. Where do we need to be to get there? Okay, now another step backwards, another step backwards. So there is a feeling of we will get something in which we both will gain. So it's a gain-gain model. But we usually don't use those kinds of models. We use more the distributive models, which make it much more difficult to reach an agreement. Other research showed that things like economic interaction, group encounters, when they are done right, when there is a sense of equality and shared goals, can help. Social and cultural events like concerts, television programs, theater, all of those things help, and of course education, which is very, very important. The last two excerpts from the interview. Abu Muhammad, a Palestinian, this is a very interesting case because his son was also sick, and he was in Beersheba in southern Israel, where his son was being treated just like the first case of that of Sohan. And he said, I did meet here other people whose children are sick, and I saw that they want for their children what I want for my children. They want them to get a good education, a good job, to marry. It is not that different from us. All the time it looks like we are so far away from each other, but I did see that when your son is sick, it is the same priorities for everybody. Enough is enough. We must fix this situation together. We have a number of problems, and the only way we can solve them is through peace. Maybe I will then even bring you and other people like you to us, so you could see that we also behave nicely with honor and respect. I think that everybody wants peace, both peoples, and it is the leadership's job to help. Maybe if they will see that everyone can help the other the way they are helping my son, and we can get along together, it will be a lot easier to do it. They will begin to think positive things and be less scared of each other. Yoav, an Israeli, said, I aspire to continue calling for the government to reach a compromise agreement with the Palestinians because I don't want to sacrifice my life and the life of my children. Our life is a lot more important than war or a fight over territories which do not contribute anything to the country. We must trust the Palestinian people. They are not all the same. Most of them believe in peace and want it. In the army, I was a combat soldier in the Goz unit. It's one of the elite commando units of the Israeli army. And I participated in not a few very hard operations that brought a great number of deaths on both sides. After my service and after I lost many good friends, I reached the conclusion that only through compromise with the Palestinian people we can accomplish a better future and security. I would like to say to all who are reading this and think that I'm naive, too liberal, or any other thoughts, that in all the years that we have had the current policy, we have lost a great number of people, soldiers, innocent civilians. In order for these terrible losses to end, we must reach a compromise and peace with our neighbors. I do believe that every one of us has to take a few minutes, look inside ourselves, and think if it is not worth it to end this difficult conflict so the lives of the people and the citizens of this country will be safer and better. I actually used my students. I had about 70% of my students were Israeli Jews. The other 30-something% were Israeli Arabs, who actually are Palestinian, and they speak Arabic as their main language. So because I wanted the interviews to be in the language of each one of the people, I had the Israeli students, the Jewish students interview Israelis, the Palestinian students interview Palestinians. Many of them interviewed their own families. I mean, the Israeli Arab students had families living inside the Palestinian territories, and they interviewed people from their own family. We did some pilot interviews before that I conducted, and we tested. They were also semi-structured interviews because the idea was not to ask specific questions, but to let the story flow, to let people say what they really wanted to say. One of the things that we know from psychology is that deep belief tends to be another factor that fuels extremism. It doesn't necessarily have to be a religious belief. In some cases, ideological beliefs, right-wing, left-wing, also are the source. But you have to have deep belief because being part of an extremist organization requires you, in a way, to cancel complex cognitive analysis. The minute you start looking at everybody as people and you start understanding the other side, it's very, very hard to become an extremist. An ideology and belief, fundamentalism, always helps you do that because you don't need to think, you just need to believe. So deep belief is a very important factor in this. And if you notice, many of these organizations, both in Israel and among the Palestinians, are organizations that have deep religious convictions. Some of them, like the person we put the interview on the book, is actually a member of the Palestinian Front for the of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is a left-wing organization. It was supposed to be a Maoist organization in a way, even though it has become a lot more, let's say, moderate, at least in the ideological sense. But deep beliefs are a very, very important factor in the development of extremism. So the more people turn to religion or to other ideologies, and the more they fall into these beliefs, the more likely it is that the violence will continue. I don't know if there is a popular movement. There are a lot of psychologists that are trying to get involved and are trying to become part of the process and the conversation. And as a matter of fact, right here at Central, we are doing a conference at the end of March, in which we're trying to bring people from different disciplines, not only psychologists, educators, political scientists, economists, even people that deal with theology and spirituality, to come and see what are the different contributions that all of these disciplines can bring to the table. It is clear that we cannot leave it just at a political level, because at a political level you might be able to sign an agreement, but to really get peace between the two peoples, you have to look at the human element. You have to look at the human factors and try to work with things that have to do with attitudes, with stereotypes, with hatred, and ultimately with understanding each other. There is a story, but it's very boring. The story is that my contract says that the marketing department in the publisher gets to choose the cover for every book. And when they told me this is the cover that they chose, I said I don't like it, and they said tough luck. So that's the story. Now, what I can tell you, what the explanation that they gave me, what they wanted to do. If you look, the top of the picture is like a mosque, and the bottom is a woman crying. So they try to do like the planting hatred on the top in the mosque and sowing pain in the bottom, the woman suffering. But I don't think it's really reflective of what the content of the book is. And they chose it probably because the marketing people thought it made sense. So I don't know to what extent it's really interesting. Yeah, actually, a lot of what I found in terms of conflict resolution, there is a very serious body of work regarding the Basque conflict in Spain and the ETA organization, and some of it is comparable to what we found. There is also a lot about the Northern Ireland conflict in Great Britain. And many of the things are very, very similar in terms of processes, in terms of who is fighting and why they are fighting. In a nutshell, the issue is this. Many of these conflicts are not about the real material issues. Many of these conflicts they take a life of their own. You might be fighting about a chair first, but then you insult me, then I insult you, and then the chair really doesn't matter anymore. It's just the fact that I hate you, you hate me, and we keep fighting. We might even forget the chair altogether at one point and just keep fighting. And in order to get to the point where you can talk, you need to address that, to say, you know what, is this conflict about the chair? Then let's forget all the issues of who's to blame, who started it, who insulted who, and let's try to focus on what are we going to do to solve the problem. As long as we keep focused on how you insulted me and how I insulted you, and how bad it is for me and how bad it is for you, you are in a culpability paradigm. And Northern Ireland and the Basque countries were places that they could not solve their differences until they were able to move past who was guilty and who was the person who started it. And they said, well, let's forget who started it. Let's focus on how are we going to solve it. Let's focus on the future and move to that. So in that sense, I think it is a very important and a very good lesson that we can learn for this conflict. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.